Okay. So welcome everyone to today's session of the Dunhuang and the Silk Road seminar. And today we're privileged to have Professor Max Deeg of Cardiff University. And Professor Deeg is professor in Buddhist studies at Cardiff, and he studied classical Indology and religious studies. And his main research interests are the history and spread of Buddhism from India to Central Asia and China. And he's published a number of works and translations, and now working on an annotated English translation of Xuanzang's 大唐西游记, which is obviously well overdue to have something like that. And today he's going to talk about silk, basically silk and Buddhist stories and silk on the Silk Road. So please welcome Professor Deeg.
Now, should I share screen?
Yes, please.
Okay, can everybody see it?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So, first of all, thank you very much, Imre, for inviting me. I'm very honored to be part of this. I'm not sure if when I see all the names, some of the names at least, I should be a little bit frightened, but let's see in which direction it goes. So my title is Trading Silk, Negotiating Religion. So it's the kind of overlap between material culture and at least stories about material culture and religion, in this case, of course, Buddhism. And I will mainly address a couple of Buddhist stories about silk along the Silk Road. And also in the second part, talk about the discourse, the Chinese discourse, or at least one Chinese discourse on silk and its use in a Buddhist context. I start with a kind of very general remarks, which a lot of you probably will or may find a little bit boring because it's well-known stuff, before I move to the to my stories as such. Well, it certainly cannot be denied that the name Silk Road, the original German Seidenstraße, evokes all kind of romantic. So that's the Silk Road. Sorry for the sometimes a bit bad quality of the pictures, but I'm very old-fashioned, so having a PowerPoint is actually already a kind of progress. So this evokes Silk Road, all kind of romantic images in different cultural settings. For instance, caravans crossing the Taklamakan desert, oasis cities with poplar trees and vineyards. The Japanese, for example, since the days of Sven Hedin's expedition, are fascinated by the wandering Lake Lop Nor on the eastern fringes of what they call the Shirukurodo, the Silk Road. So that's on the right map, where you can see actually the lake positioned in two different locations. Chinese might think of the Feitian of their side of the Silu, or of the Silk Road, the flying deities, who became one of the dominating motifs and symbols for denoting the Silk Road and its culture. Silk is probably not at the forefront of this imagery. So in the light of this, one could ask now, what entitles us to use the term Silk Road, restricted as it were, by one item of material culture for a regional and historical entity like the vast area between the Near and the Far East? It has been indeed searched for alternative names for different stretches of the connecting routes between Europe and Asia, leading to the labeling of them as Incense Road, Spice Road, Paper Road, etc. As is well known, it was the German geographer and explorer Ferdinand von Richthofen. Normally, with students, I would now insert the uncle of the Red Baron, who coined this name, die großen Seidenstraßen, in his voluminous opus China, Ergebnisse einer Reise und darauf gegründeter Studien, China, Results of Self-Undertaken Journeys and Studies Based Thereon, published in 1877. In the typical Eurocentric, in modern terms, one probably would say Orientalist way of his time, he used the trade product introduced from China along these trade routes, which were best known in the Roman Empire and late antiquity, silk, as a demarcating term for what is historically, geographically, culturally, and religiously a part of the world, with stretched from the Mediterranean to the Chinese Sea. It would now be easy to defy the term Silk Road as a pure invention of a colonialist-oriented Western geographer, who, when he was coining the name, probably bore in mind the well-known episode of the Roman silk tax on the product to avoid the flux of gold reserves out of the Roman Empire. But it should not be forgotten that silk was indeed, in some cases, one of the material commodities defining Chinese cultural self-identity, but also the perception of this Far Eastern realm in what the Chinese called Western region, Xiyu, that is the regions and empires west of the Gansu corridor. This is clearly shown by the fact that the oldest name for the Chinese in the West, the Ceres of Apollodorus of Artemita, that's, I think, the first occurrence in the 2nd century BC, is very probably derived from a Chinese loanword in Greek for silk, seir, a Chinese modern pronunciation, si. As is well known, silk was a textile which had already fascinated the nomadic steppe tribes of Central Asia, the Persians, and the Romans, whose economy it had started to influence. I already talked about it in a way that the Roman Senate in 16 AD had to issue an edict to regulate its use. That's reported, I think, first in Tacitus Annales 233. This product seemed indeed to be the most suitable item to give a name to roads of trade, cultural and religious exchange, which in the East already started under the unified empire of the Eastern Han. Though arguably its heydays would come centuries later during the rule of the Tang dynasty. While a simplified view of the Silk Road, or Silk Roads, probably in plural, implied by the very name, is that of a monodirectional trade of silk and other products from east to west, reality was certainly more complex. The monopoly of silk as a Chinese product was already broken in the first half of the first millennium, first by the application of silk weaving techniques on imported silk threads or cocoons, and later by the introduction of the cultivation procedure of the raw material through the mulberry-fed domesticated silkworm to the Western regions, to Central Asia, at least in the 5th century, and this will be one of the topics of my stories, to Iran, India, and finally also into the Mediterranean region. It is rather the spread of this production technology over a relatively long period of time than the product itself, the silk thread or finished silk cloth, which entitles us to speak of the Silk Road in the historical period from roughly the start of the Christian era to what would be the late medieval period in the West. Now, in the light of my title, one could still ask, what has this all and what has silk to do with religion? It is certainly not exaggerated to stress the importance of the trade routes through Central Asia for the spread of various religions like Buddhism, Mazdaism, Manichaeism, Christianity, and Judaism to the east. The Silk Road is rather a route of cultural communication than a purely economic and commercial road. And this seems to be the main point of fascination of its modern name, beyond the question of its applicability in real historical terms. Now, concerning the connection between religion and silk, there is more to be said. The Chinese historian Liu Xinru, in her book Silk and Religion, published 1988, has rightly pointed to the fact that it was within the context of religions and their practice that silk became a more common trade good compared to earlier periods of production in which it was reserved by political measures and intrinsic price politics to the representational use of the ruling class of society. The use of the fabric in the context of burial and ritual along the Silk Road or Silk Roads demonstrates this quite clearly. Now, in this talk, I would like to focus on the eponymous product or commodity, on silk, its socio-cultural value, and its relation to religion for at least one of the oasis cities along the Silk Road and in the Chinese Buddhist discourse. Like most other culturally and economically precious item, silk and its production became the subject of stories, explaining how it came to be cultivated. In China, one grasps different legends about sericulture's origin in Chinese ancient times. It was either connected with the mythical Yellow Emperor, Huangdi, or his consort, Lady Xiling. I think I have a picture of her. The importance of silk and its production also led to a high position of silk in the framework of imperial rights and to a specific cult of the legendary figures connected with its invention and cultivation. Legends about the introduction of the production of the precious silk into regions outside of China were not restricted to the Asian regions as such, but were also produced or brought forward in other countries. It's well known that there is an East Roman report of a story according to which monks from the East, here is a picture of this story, from Serinda, brought silkworm eggs to Constantinople in hollow monk staffs under the reign of Emperor Justinian in 551 AD. So that would be, according to that legend, the start of silk production, silk cultivation in the West. On the other side of the geographical and cultural thread spun by the Silk Road, the earliest report, or rather legend, of the transmission of the secret of silk production, sericulture in Western direction, is given by, this will not come as a surprise to those who know me, by the famous Chinese Buddhist traveler Xuanzang, who traveled on the southern Silk Road on his way back to China around 645. In the 12th fascicle, Juan, of his travelogue Datang Xi Yu Ji, the records of the Western regions, he reports a legend how the craft of producing silk had been introduced in one of the most important regions along the southern Silk Road into Khotan, on the southwestern rim of the Tarim Basin. So Xuanzang's travel, so it doesn't include the Central Asian part of it. And here the area of Khotan, the archaeological sites. And this, I think, is taken from Stein maps of Khotan according to Chinese and Tibetan sources. I will leave that on the screen for the time being. Now, to the story. Xuanzang reports the following, quote, 5 or 6 miles to the southeast of the royal city of Khotan, there is a Mashi monastery, which was established by the consort of a former king of the kingdom. In old times, this country had no knowledge about mulberry trees and silkworms. And when it was heard that the kingdom in the east, that is of course China, had them, an embassy was sent to ask for them. At this time, the ruler of the Eastern Kingdom concealed them and would not give them away, but strictly ordered to keep them safely and not to let the seeds of the mulberry tree or the silkworms get outside of the kingdom. The king of Khotan, Gostana, as Xuanzang calls it, in Sanskrit terminology, humbly sent gifts and proposed for a marriage alliance with the Eastern Kingdom, China, in token of his allegiance and submission. The ruler of the Eastern Kingdom was well affected to the kingdoms far away and granted him his wish. The king of Gostana dispatched a messenger to escort his future wife and admonished him, "Speak thus to the princes of the Eastern Kingdom. Our kingdom has neither silk nor the seeds of the mulberry tree or silkworms. It may be good to bring them so that you can make robes for yourself." When the woman heard this, she secretly procured the seeds and concealed them in her headdress. When they arrived at the border station, on the Chinese side is meant, the guards searched everywhere, but they did not dare checking the princess's headdress. When they entered the kingdom of Gostana, they stopped at the site of the Mashi monastery, prepared everything according to the etiquette, and then welcomed her in the royal palace, but left the mulberry seeds and the silkworms at this place. When springtime arrived, mulberry seeds were planted, and when the month of the silkworms, that is the 3rd lunar month, approached, they picked the mulberry leaves to feed them. When they had just arrived, it was necessary to feed them on various kinds of leaves, but afterwards there were plenty of mulberry trees. The royal consort then chiseled into stone a regulation that it was not permitted to kill the silkworms. It was only after the silk moths had all swarmed that one could take care of the cocoons. Whoever violated this rule should be deprived of divine protection, meaning being punished. Thereupon she established this monastery, this Sangharama, on behalf of the first silkworms. And there are numerous old mulberry tree trunks, which are said to be trees having grown from the first seeds. From old time till now, this kingdom has possessed silkworms and not killed them. People who secretly take away the silk are not allowed to rear silkworms for many years. Unquote. Now, this is the story in Xuanzang's report, and the monastery we are talking about is on this map down here, called Ma Shi in Chinese. Now, interestingly enough, so these are the sources I'm using, this legend is not repeated in Xuanzang's biography, the text with a impossible long title, Da Tang Zi En Zi San Zang Fa Shi Zhuan, which mostly runs closely parallel with the information normally given in the Xi Ji, in Xuanzang's autograph. The legend reported by Xuanzang, therefore, could pass as an isolated and singular one, were it not repeated in other sources and non-Chinese sources. On the Chinese side, we find it in the Xin Tang Shu, compiled and submitted to the throne by Ouyang Xiu in the Song period, which gives an abridged and slightly distorted version of the narrative in the Da Tang Xi Ji. A more striking evidence of an underlying, very probably original Khotanese legend, maybe even in Khotanese language, is another version of the story found in the Tibetan chronicle of Khotan, the Liul Chejung, the history of the Dharma in Khotan, which indicates that the relation between silk and religion was negotiated in quite different ways. So one being represented by Xuanzang's version of the story and the another one by the Tibetan one, which will follow now. And I quote in Emmerich's translation, mostly at least, quote, after King Vijaya built the Gumtir Vihara, during 2 generations of kings, no other Vihara was built. After that, a king called Vijayajaya took to wife the daughter of a Chinese king called Punyeshvara. That Chinese king's daughter, having come to the Li country, that is Khotan, desiring seed of silkworms, reared silkworms in the district of Maja, which obviously is the Tibetan version of Ma Shi in Xuanzang's Da Tang Xi Ji. While the silkworms were still not mature, some ignorant minister said, King Vijayajaya, the Chinese king's daughter, acting as the king's consort, has come rearing many poisonous snakes in Maja. Then when they have grown big and one is dejected about the harm to the districts, what is to be done? The king ordered, set fire to the snake rearing house and burn them all up. On hearing of this, the queen, being unable at the moment to explain it to the king with knowledge, extracted some of the silkworms and reared them in secret. Afterwards, having produced cashmere-like silk and cotton, she wove silk and mendri, and showing them to the king, she explained it in detail with knowledge. And the king repented. When a monk, the Arya Sangha Ghosha by name, had come from the country of India to the Li country, he invited him to become his pious friend, his Kalyana Mitra. Having made confession so that he was absolved of his grave sin in killing silkworms in great quantity, he built the great stupa and vihara of Potarya and Maza, and he presented many relics of the Buddha of the Tathagata. Therefore, in accordance with the prophecy of the Aryas, Buddhists, that throughout the beginning of the first spring month, an image of the form of the Lord, Shakyamuni, would be in the vihara called Mazo Potarya, probably the monastery referred to above, down to the present day, the twofold Sangha of the Li country, and from king and ministers down to the subjects, have all assembled in the Potarya Vihara each year at the beginning of the first spring month to do worship. Thus, this Vihara is powerful and its splendor is great. Unquote. Now let us compare the two different versions. You probably have seen that there are differences, but there are also commonalities. Now the motive of the Chinese princess bringing the silkworms in her hairdress, smuggling it into the country from China into Khotan, is completely missing in the in the Tibetan text, sorry, but can be implied as having been known in Khotan by the whole storyline and from a painting on a wooden plank in Dunhuang, an archaeological site in Khotan. This is a picture from Stein's voluminous work about Khotan, an archaeological site close to the ancient capital of Khotan. So clearly what you can see here is somehow a representation of this smuggling of the silkworm in the hairdress of this eminent person, a halo around her head, a woman, and a figure actually pointing towards the headdress. The Tibetan either dismisses or attempts to disguise the fact that the worms and seeds were brought to Khotan illegally in a way, which could be the official reading of the underlying Khotanese version. You don't report about yourself being a thief. Despite their differences, the two versions, the one reported by Xuanzang and the Tibetan story, which probably goes back, as I said, to a Khotanese original, which is now lost, show enough common features to prove their regional authenticity. The Tibetan source gives the name of the king, and thereby the events can be dated to the period of King Vijayajaya. This demonstrates, now we underlying the kind of reconstructed lineage of the Khotanese early kings, who all wore Indian names. This demonstrates that at least the local tradition placed the introduction of sericulture into Khotan to the beginning of the 5th century, the assumed reign period of King Vijayajaya. Now, what is interesting in Xuanzang's story and in the Tibetan legend is that they both connect the bringing of a culturally and economically valuable craft, sericulture, the production of silk, with religion, particularly with Buddhism. The clear difference is that the Indian element, the Indian master of the Tibetan source, is completely missing now in the Chinese plot. It replaces the action of compassion through the Chinese princess, who by an edict forbids harming the silkworms, and Xuanzang is quite clear about this detail, the grubs inside of the cocoons. The Tibetan story is much more radical in that it has the king, on the bad advice of his officials, kill the silkworms, which he ignorantly mistakes for snakes. Here, the advice of an Indian Buddhist master is needed to stop the king from his heinous action and its karmic consequences. The Chinese princess in the Tibetan version, at the very beginning she's there, has almost become a blind motive, with her role being reduced to rearing the silkworms. As a narrative agent, she shows a certain inconsistency. First, she is not able to explain the function of the silkworms to the king, but then suddenly, after having woven the fabric, she is able to present him with the full information and the technology. The fact that she obviously bears an Indian name in the Tibetan version, Punyeshwara, an odd form anyway, as in Sanskrit one would rather expect a female Punyeshwari, might indicate that the version underlying the preserved Tibetan text might have been even more Indianized than the Tibetan one, in which the Chinese princess was missing completely. So in the original, more Indianized version. The silkworm story, sitting there like a blind motif at the beginning, seems to have the only function of introducing the Indian monk Sangha Ghosha and his meritorious activities of conversion in the realm of Khotan into the story. It seems that Xuanzang puts, quite understandably, more emphasis on the Chinese elements of the legend. It is the Chinese princess who brings, indirectly incited by the Khotanese king, who almost acts here like a cultural trickster by convincing her to do so. So bring it so that you have it in my kingdom. The two main items for sericulture, the seeds of the mulberry tree and the silkworms to Khotan. The fact that it is a woman of high status who brought sericulture to Khotan may well go back to Chinese myths about the origin of the craft, to a divine lady, the anthropomorphic goddess already mentioned, Lady Xiling, the principal consort of the mythical Yellow Emperor. The important point of the two sericultural essentials, the silkworm and the mulberry seed, in the headdress of the Chinese princess is missing in the Tibetan version, as we've seen, but must have been essential at least in the second half of the first millennium, as it is found in Central Asian mural paintings here on the screen from Khotan and elsewhere. Now, the fact that we have tested an Indianized and a Sinicized version of what was obviously the same, or at least a very similar narrative about the introduction and the fate of sericulture in Khotan should not surprise us. Khotan has been influenced from an early period, the Indian names of the kings were already mentioned, from India and from China as well. And the different versions of the founding of the Khotanese dynasty, the famous story of the prince earth-pressed Chinese Diru, Tibetan Sanu, found in Xuanzang's record of the Western region, but also in the Tibetan chronicles, clearly provides a parallel case in which the Chinese story bestows the role of the successful agent and first ruler to the Chinese, while the Tibetans actually emphasize the Indian influence. And just as an example, a map of Khotan from the, of the position of Khotan at the time of the Kushan Empire, where you can clearly see the overlap. Then culturally, in terms of material culture, these famous Khotanese silver coins, where you have on the one hand side, on the recto, a Kharoshthi inscription, Indian, on the reverse side, a Chinese inscription. And then, of course, the Indian influence in form of manuscripts in Khotanese Saka, written in Brahmi, in Buddhist monasteries and other sites, archaeological sites. Now, the stories of the introduction of sericulture into Khotan clearly reflects real aspects of concerns of the cultivation practice, at least seen from a Buddhist standpoint. Mulberry, Morus alba and Morus bombycis, Chinese baisang and jingsang, was an essential element of Chinese silk production from the domestic silkworm, the Bombyx mori. And the importance of it is clearly emphasized in Xuanzang's version, in which the proper production can only start after the first seeds of the mulberry tree have grown into trees. From ancient times, the chrysalis in the cocoon was killed in order to get good quality thread, meaning a continuous silk thread. And only hard cocoons were normally allowed to hatch to get enough moths for procreating and breeding the next generation of worms and insects. I think I have pictures about this production. So this is, of course, not that old. That's from around 1330. Steaming the cocoons, killing the worms and the different forms of silkworms, wild and domesticated. Now, the two stories, the Tibetan and the Chinese from Khotan, clearly concentrate on the moral issue of killing the silkworms. However, in two quite different ways. While the Tibetan version, which stresses the wrongdoing of the king and his absolution from his deeds, is in a way more Buddhist. Xuanzang's story, one could say surprisingly, because he's a Buddhist as well, is more concerned with the smuggling and the preserving and protection of the silkworms and the mulberry seeds than with the karmic effect which this has on the agents of the legend. That Xuanzang actually was morally concerned with respect to the issue of killing living beings, silkworms, in the process of gaining silk is not directly addressed in the story, but may be reflected in his biographer's Huili's statement in the biography that the master himself preferred wearing felt, from which one could conclude, but must not necessarily do so, that he was not very fond of silk, although he received, of course, and must have worn it on some occasions. Now, the ethical aspect in Xuanzang's story is combined with a very practical one. How can one get silk from broken cocoons while insisting on the use of proper food for the silkworms, the leaves of the mulberry tree? If we strip Xuanzang's version of its moral component, we are left with a technical point of Indian silk production, which was indeed, if we believe the description in the texts and compare this with the way silk was normally produced in China, gained from broken or hatched cocoons. It was made from the cocoons of the wild silkworm, here the smaller one on the picture on the right-hand side, the so-called Yechan in Chinese, and was called in Indian, in Sanskrit, Kaushea, transcribed by Xuanzang himself in the second chapter of his Datang Xi Qi, in the description of India, the general description of India as Jiao Shi Ye. Xuanzang himself reports about this material in his general description of India, as I said, and gives some details about silk production in India. Now, Khotan is an old kingdom devoted to Mahayana practice, might particularly have stressed the non-killing of living beings, the silkworms, as this is reported by most of the pilgrim records. And this may be the underlying reason of Xuanzang's report of the prohibition of killing silkworms through the Chinese princess. Indirectly, this seems to be supported by 2 cocoons from the Tang period found in Xinjiang. Now, this is silk production from Khotan, still practiced today. So they are boiled and killed. I come back to this one. 2 cocoons from the Tang period found in Xinjiang, southwest of Bachu, from which the moths have obviously already swarmed. So there are kind of broken parts. And by similar cocoons and desiccated remains of mulberry tree from as early as the 3rd century AD, discovered in Nia, near Khotan on the southern Silk Road. So this is, by the way, still a hint to the way the Indians produce silk. This is from the advertisement of a modern West Bengal Indian silk fabrication plant, the Ketya Ahimsa Silk Manufacturing. So you already can see in the title that there is a focus on the non-killing. And this is also then in the flyer quite well explained. So there's a continuity from old times to the modern period. Okay, now Xuanzang's version of the Khotanese story seems to reflect a specific Buddhist concern of whether wearing silk involves killing of living beings, which was discussed in monastic Chinese circles in the 6th century and a little bit later, in which the Vinaya master Dao Xuan played a crucial role. The concern of some Buddhists of that time about wearing silk is clearly shown by an apologetic story about the Buddha's upper garment, a kashaya, where Dao Xuan's text, well, it's lost, but it's preserved in Dao Shi's Fayan Zhulin, the so-called Tang Shaman Dao Xuan Gan Tong Jia Sha Zhi Yan. The evidence of the miraculous kashaya reported or kind of envisioned by the Tang Shramana Dao Xuan, more envisioned probably than really preserved as a text, as in a lot of cases with Dao Xuan's textual productions. Now I quote this story, it's a little bit long, but let's see, I still have a little bit of time, I guess, to give you an impression how the argument goes in Dao Xuan's defense of, well, not using silk. That's of course his point. Quote, further, the Buddha told Manjushri, go with the help of your magical power to the Jetavana Park, bring my bejeweled case on top of the Western Jewel Tower and show it to the Great Assembly. When I had just jumped over the city wall of Kapilavastu and had left the palace of my fatherly king, after 40 miles, I came to this forest. Now, the Buddha is now actually giving a part of his biography, of course. My body was a little bit weary, and I rested for a moment. At that time, the spirit in the tree, the spirit of the tree, appeared in front of me and said to me, you now practice the concentration on the Tao, on enlightenment, hast received a golden body, and will become the great teacher of the 3 worlds. At the time of the nirvana of the previous Buddha Kashyapa, he entrusted me with his pearl case and a silken Sanghati and asked me to transmit them to you. A Sanghati is, of course, part of the robes, of the 3 robes of the Buddhist monks and of the Buddha as well. The Buddha told the spirit, I cannot use your silken Sanghati. I've heard that the elders say that all the Buddhas who have appeared in the world have not worn robes from silkworms. At present, I'm striving for enlightenment. How could I then harm living beings? By offering me to wear this garment, now you are like Mara and thereby impose irritation to me. The tree spirit said, why do you, the great sage, speak so rudely? Indeed, all the Buddhas, out of compassion, do not wear robes from silkworms. The production of this silk has not involved harming living beings. Accept now this pearl case, open it, and inside there will be a letter. So I, the Buddha, opened the case and saw this wonder. There was a large Vinaya and Sutra Pitaka, so a canon, so to speak, the legacy of the teaching of Kashyapa in this case. And when I looked at the Sanghati there was a letter left from the hand of this Buddha, which he had given to the tree spirit in order to transmit it to me. The letter of the Buddha Kashyapa read, "When I reached enlightenment, the great god Brahma gave me this piece of silk. In its production, no boiling of the chrysalis was involved. The king of the gods, Brahma, gave the warp, and the divine ruler firm earth, that may be Prithvi or Dhritarashtra, gave the woof, and both donors then made one dharma garment. For this reason, they have given it to me, and from the moment of my enlightenment, I have always worn it draped over my shoulder and have never damaged it. Now I bestow it on you, Siddhartha. If you will reach enlightenment, you should take this Sangati and safeguard it in Jetavana. When the time of the transmission of the Vinaya will come, probably to Maitreya, you should wear it on my behalf, and therefore I now left you this garment. 100 years after your nirvana, there will first be unwise monks who will divide the Vinaya Pitaka into 5 sections. That's obviously an allusion to the Vinaya in 5 sections, the Mahishasaka Vinaya. And from there, 100 years later, they will divide your sutras and will split them into numerous sections. They will dispute and cause the Dharma to decline even faster. Because these stupid monks do not preoccupy themselves with the Tripitaka, they will, after having heard that you have started wearing silken robes, kill silkworms. After you will have reached enlightenment, this silk be produced in these kingdoms, and there will be the crime of killing silkworms. Therefore, I have given this robe to the tree spirit, who now gives it to you. In this case, my whole legacy is contained, and I entrust you with conserving my inherited Dharma. After now the Buddha speaking again, Siddhartha, after I had read this, the earth shook 6-fold, the case sprang open and emitted a great light. And the tree spirit spoke to me, "You shall put this case for the rope on your left shoulder, venerate it always, and should never put it somewhere else. The pearl case can, if placed on the shoulder, destroy all maras, subdue all heretics, and will lead you to faster enlightenment." Since I accepted this case, again the Buddha speaking, I always had it on my left shoulder until I received the milk gruel, that is shortly before enlightenment. When I was sitting underneath the Bodhi tree, the ruler of the gods, Chakra, came to me, took the case from my shoulder, opened it, took out the Sangati, and dressed me with it. And he also took the rugged Sangati of the Buddha Kashyapa and placed it on top of the silken robe. King Brahma ordered the rulers of the gods, Chakra, to give me another robe, which I accepted as the others before, and put on 3 layers of robe on me, 2 being the robes of the Buddha Kashyapa, and the other the one which I allowed monks to wear, so a normal Sangati. The king of the gods, the great Brahma, came and said to me, "I've seen the Buddhas of the past also wearing 3 robes, unsurpassable on earth. It is appropriate for the world-honored one to give up the 2 great robes, store them back at their original places, and wear the robe which I have given you not before the great earth has become firm again." Thereupon I addressed the king of the gods accordingly. The great earth may consequently become firm. Furthermore, the Buddha Shakyamuni, from his enlightenment to his nirvana, has only worn a rugged Sangati and 3 robes made of white cloth, and has not yet worn the silk warm robe or silk fabric. Why do the evil monks distort my words by saying that in the teaching of the Vinaya, it is said that I gave permission to wear it? When I had just achieved enlightenment, the nun Mahaprajapati, the Buddha's stepmother, gave me with her own hands a golden kashaya, but I have not dared to accept it and asked her to give it to the Sangha. How could I, the great master of the 3 worlds, put on a silkworm robe? Although I have allowed in the Tripitaka to donate colored silk to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, so it is originally not silk floss produced out of the mouth of silkworms, which means of killed silkworms. Outside of our Jambudvipa and the great continent, there are 1,800 great kingdoms which all possess silk and silk floss produced out of the mouth of women. It is not produced out of the mouth of silkworms, meaning silkworms are not killed, And because it is originated from the killing of living being, it is not originated from the killing of living being, it does not affect negative merit. How now can one know about the silk which is produced out of the mouth of women and not the normal silk where silkworms are killed? The answer is that if one wants silk for robes, one must burn incense and go underneath a mulberry tree. Immediately, there will be two divine girls who will magically appear from underneath the tree, looking like 8-year-old girls, and they spit silk from their mouth. The people of these kingdoms merely set up their spindles and spin the silk coming out of the mouths of the girls. When they have spun enough on their spindles, the silk will stop and the magically produced girls will disappear. The silk, says the Buddha, that I have allowed to wear is silk from these women and heavenly colored silk. No harm of living beings is involved in collecting and using it. Why do they slander me of harming living beings by collecting silk and use it? Unquote. So the message is clear. He comes up with a story, Dao Xuan comes up with a story, put into the mouth of the Buddha, according to which the silk that the Buddha wears actually is not normal silk, but is of divine origin and where no killing is involved. Now, this story reflects the concern of Mahayana Buddhists with silk and the killing of living beings, the silkworms or the chrysalis involved in silk production. Dao Xuan is well known as the founder of the Chinese Vinaya school, which made the Dharmaguptaka Vinaya, the Sifan Lü, the main textual basis for the regulation of monastic life. We've already heard a kind of allusion to the other monastic tradition of the Mahisangaka, which of course he rejects. For Dao Xuan, this issue was quite important, as he also discusses it at length in a treatise called Etiquette for Wearing the Ceremonial Robes of a Buddhist Monk, Shimen Zhang Fu Yi. And I think I should not read this one out. So it makes more or less the same point that actually one should not kill silkworms and should wear the robes that are not made from silk. So for Dao Xuan, obviously, the issue was important enough to repeat it again, some of the arguments at least, and add some other points. For instance, that Indian monks did not dress in silken robes in another treatise, the record of the stimuli and responses related to the characteristics of the Vinaya, the Lü Xiang Gan Tong Zhuan. And this one I read out, quote, only the passage about the Indian monks not wearing silk robes. How can one use material gained from killing living beings and use it as garments of compassion? This is absolutely not at the point. How can the Buddhist masters possibly promote this kind of view? The answer is, I, meaning Dao Xuan, I read in the Da Zhi Du Lun, in the Mahaprajna Paramita Shastra, that the Buddha was seen wearing a sangati made of coarse cloth. Since he cherished it, how can we oppose this? And after one has heard the rules of the Vinaya, then even if one sees silk garments or bedding being produced of it, one should destroy it to rubble. By doing this, one will be even more praised and lauded than before. In ancient times of the Zhou dynasty, that is the time when the Buddha, according to his scheme of time, actually was living, the senior monks all were wearing large cotton robes. Senior monks in this case, of course, are the Indian monks. For a whole lifetime, they only dressed in patched robes, and all cloth used for them only weighed 2 or 3 jin. And if we again look at the Indian monks, the Fanzheng, who have come from the West to China, they all are wearing cotton and felt. So the answer to the whole question is, in the kingdoms of the 5 Indias, silk robes were not worn. Therefore, one should be encouraged to contemplate on the way of wearing such ceremonial robes by looking at the accomplished teachings of old and present to understand the rules about bedding and the 3 monastic robes. Furthermore, the intention behind wearing the Dharma robes should follow the spirit of compassion and benevolence of the original vow of a bodhisattva. Without benevolence, there is nothing by which living beings can be rescued. To rescue them, one must protect them by benevolence. Therefore, those who have the Buddha mind also have great compassion. To kill living beings and act compassionately at the same time, this was never possible. Now, after Xuanzang and Dao Xuan, the famous other Buddhist traveler, Yi Jing, in his Nanhai Jigu Nefa Chuan, the record of the inner Dharma sent back from the Southern Sea, very often read as a description of Indian monastic practices, but rather actually a kind of a representation of the Mula Sarvastivadin Vinaya, is actually aware of this discourse, and as a stern propagator of this mentioned Vinaya, of the Mula Sarvasti Vinaya, and thus opposed to the Vinaya school of Daoxuan, of the Dharmaguptaka, tried to argue pragmatically that the use of silk has not been prohibited by the Buddha. So the other side of the story, in quote, now as for silk, it was no other than the saint, the Buddha, who has started its use. Why? To prohibit its use then. If one raises this as an issue, to forbid its use of the use of silk was done out of consideration for saving living beings, but it caused even more complications. The sanghas of the four denominations of the four Nikayas in the five Indias all wear silk. That's a contradiction, of course, of what Daoxuan said before. Why should one give up wearing silk, which is easily obtained, and instead look for muslin, which is difficult to obtain, probably in China? Impeding the goal of the way, that is enlightenment, lies herein. This kind of rule is a strict regulation which has not been issued by the Buddha. It eventually will cause the ones who act virtuously and hold the Vinaya in esteem to become more arrogant and look down on the rest. Noble ones who have no demands and few desires are certainly inwardly abashed and outwardly ashamed that the issue of covering the body is supposed to be the great way, and not even more about other issues. But those who hold that view, that wearing silk is not permitted, claim that from destroying life results damage to the highest goal of loving kindness of Maitri, and that out of the principle to have compassion with animated beings, one should give up to use silk. If this is the case, then wearing clothes and eating food causes a lot of damage to living beings as well. If one does not take care of mole crickets and earthworms, why should one then especially look after chrysalis? If one was to protect all living beings, then consequently there is no support for one's own body. But for what reason should one give up one's life? By deducing from the evidence with reason, it should not be like that. However, the ones who do not eat ghee, who do not wear leather shoes, and do not wear silk wedding are of this kind. Now, as for killing, only destroying life on purpose leads to karmic consequences. If it is not done deliberately, then the Buddha says that it is not an offense. It is already not suitable for a layman, for example, to ask for living cocoons or witness with his own eyes the destruction of the insect. How much less for someone who wishes to abandon the world, that is a monk, unquote. Now, obviously, and in the end, Daoxuan lost the battle, and the pragmatism of the likes of I Ching determined how Buddhist monks, Chinese Buddhist monks and nuns, dealt with the moral problem of wearing silk. The material discussed shows how silk, I would say, has influenced and even to a certain extent shaped the religio-cultural identity of at least some of the peoples living along it in Khotan and in China. I would conclude from this rather emphatically than derived from a stringent and rational logical standpoint that we are well entitled to use and to keep the cherished term Silk Road, although we are not dealing with silk and its trade as the main cultural and economical issue along it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Deeg, for this enlightening talk. And I'll stop the recording, first of all.
Should I leave sharing screen?